This is Blackstone Joe, and you're listening to Slick Talk.
If I say I'm an oil man, you will agree.
There's the stink of oil about him.
Hello and welcome to episode 131 of Slick Talk. I am your host, Blackstone Joe, and I'm glad you're here. On the back of our oil information slips, we ask if you've used any additives. Now, specifically, we're talking about additives that are not in the oil already. If you're a maintenance enthusiast, you might know already that each API-certified product is going to have a great deal of additive in it right off the shelf. Elements like molybdenum, phosphorus, zinc, calcium, magnesium. These comprise the recipe of the additive package that is present in the oil, but some people like to make it their own. And as I sit here just days away from Thanksgiving, recipes are definitely on the brain, but in this case, we're not talking about the turkey you bring to your table, but the oil you put in your engine, transmission, differential, whatever it may be that needs oil to do its job. And on today's show, I'll be breaking down how certain types of additives can impact what we'll find in analysis, as well as the consequences there may be for whatever system it is you're taking care of. So without further ado, I want to jump in by talking about a couple of additives that I saw the very same day that I'm recording this episode. Specifically, this was belonging to an automotive engine where the owner was thinking it might be towards the end of its life, and they were trying to do a couple of different things to keep that motor going. One was a reseal additive. Now, right off the bat, I'll tell you this is one additive that doesn't really stand out in testing, meaning it doesn't contain elements that we test for, and it's also not going to throw off the physical properties. So it was rather easy to dispense with that element having any particular impact on wear metals or how the physical properties matched up with what we expected from the oil type. And in general, that's probably a safe bet. However, I bring it up to mention that we do want to know everything you're using because there can be exceptions to the rule. So even if you think that, well, I'm using a reseal additive, and if AT205, like this owner noted, didn't show up, then mine won't either. Well, best to note it anyhow, because there are always different recipes coming out, and different additives may use a different lineup of ingredients. So go ahead and note it anyway, because importantly, the owner also noted a flush. So in addition to the reseal product, they were trying to clean up the motor, removing deposits, and in their mind, they also thought it might bring a great deal of improvement in the wear metals by using a flush and then sampling the oil both before and after for a good comparison. Delving into the results, we found quite a bit of chrome as well as lead in the used oil, both before and after. Now, before the flush was used, chrome was off the charts at 32 parts per million. And for those of you who are not accustomed to thinking about metals on this scale, most engines are going to make maybe 1 part per million on average. So seeing a level of 32 really jumps out, especially when it's the dominant metal in all, because typically you'll see iron as the dominant metal. The majority of wearing components are typically steel, so that makes sense. Then you'll see an element like copper or aluminum. So chrome really jumped off the page. And unfortunately, using the flush didn't really impact metals much. There were some decreases, a little less chrome, a little less iron, a little less copper. Whether that's due to the flush or not, however, is really hard to say. The reason being, the before and after samples were our first opportunities to see how this engine was wearing. As such, it's entirely possible that the second sample is more the norm. It really takes 3 samples to build a trend. And while the flush and whether or not it was having any significant impact on the metals was inconclusive, it was an obvious factor in another way, specifically the physical properties and how they matched up with what we expected, because the viscosity was thin, and the flash point was low. Typically, fuel dilution is going to cause this sort of scenario in the absence of a solvent-based additive, but when you use a flush and then sample, well, it can lower the flash point just like fuel would, and it can thin the viscosity too in some cases, although it's more common to see a low flash point. Regardless, these are hallmarks of using a flush and something to keep in mind if you're about to use one yourself, in that it's not a bad thing to do if we know the likely reason for a low viscosity, a low flash point. It's not the end of the world. But consider this. If you're an owner who is suspecting a fuel system issue, let's say, if you're hoping to find one, if you have a reason to suspect a cracked or leaking injector, a bad fuel pump, so on and so forth, using a flush, then sending in a sample, well, it can cloud whether or not there's really a great deal of fuel there. So you want to keep that in mind before using one. So if you're taking care of a motor and you don't have any reason to suspect a fuel system issue, but you still want to sample after having used a flush, feel free. In this case, though, it was a situation where the motor, even with metals looking a bit better after having used the flush, we still saw that same mess of chrome that showed up initially, a level far above average, and again, serving as the dominant metal, so it certainly looks like this engine has a serious issue in one or more of the cylinders. And to take it a step further, using an additive is not a likely solution, even if metals were a bit lower, because again, keep in mind, if it's our first look and then you use an additive, the second look still doesn't quite establish a trend. But fortunately, regardless of the additive, regardless of trends not yet being accessible, we're still looking at a concerning amount of metal. As such, a close inspection involving a compression test, which can help identify which, if not multiple cylinders, is contributing a lot of metal, that was the way to go, regardless of the additives that were in use. Another likely consequence of using a flush, although it didn't happen in this case, but I've seen it in plenty of others, is a high insolubles level. Now, that would actually be an example of the flush working, I would say, in the sense that you want a flush to free up sludge deposits that are left behind in the engine, stuff that normally wouldn't make it into the drain anyway. So if you do use a flush, in addition to possibly running into a thin viscosity, a low flash point, you'll likely also run into a higher insolubles level than you would otherwise, but that would kind of be a good sign in my book. You want to clean up the engine, if you see a lot of solids in the used oil, that would actually be a likely consequence of the flush. Again, it's possible that you can also have a situation where the oil filter was working poorly and a flush left some solid material go by that otherwise it normally wouldn't in the drain. Still, I wouldn't be too worried if you used a flush and wound up with a high insolubles level. While some additives, such as the reseal product I mentioned earlier, aren't necessarily apt to show up, some truly are, and one of them is Restore. We tend to see Restore fairly often as far as the additives go. We often run into owners that are taking care of vehicles that need a lot of TLC. We cater to a lot of owners that are not only trying to take care of their daily driver, but maybe they found a used car or they're trying to turn a project car into their daily driver. Whatever the case may be, a product with Restore in the name makes sense for the customers that we help on a daily basis. However, Restore doesn't necessarily help us because it contains a high concentration of copper and lead. Copper and lead also tend to show brass-bronze wear in analysis. So it can be a particularly sticky situation if you are taking care of a motor or bringing one back to life, and you're wondering how the bearings or the bushings, any brass bronze component is doing, and then you add Restore before sending in a sample, well, that can cloud exactly what metal is from the Restore and what metal is from the engine. Now, if it's a situation where I'm looking at a motor and everything looks great, except for high levels of copper and lead, well, there's good reason to give the engine some leeway in that regard, especially if, say, there's no contamination like coolant that would have caused copper and lead to go up like they would in the absence of Restore. But still, if you're in a position where you're suspicious of a bearing problem or you simply want a good, accurate look, at how the bearings and other brass bronze parts are doing, Restore is one additive that I would say you might not want to use, at least until you have a good handle on things. And again, not to rain on the Restore parade, but it's not going to prevent a bearing problem from progressing. We don't see instances where motors suddenly wear better in other ways than they were before using Restore, but we do see a lot of copper and lead with that in use. And it's one additive that I would really stress you mention if you've used it, even if it's been an oil change or two ago. Because again, as I said earlier, we're talking about a pretty high concentration of copper and lead, and it takes a few oil changes for all of that to wash out. Keep that in mind, because even a few oil changes removed, we might see quite a bit of copper and lead from it. And as such, there's reason not really to assume poor wear. Rather, the additive could just be making its way out. Other additives tend to wash out pretty quick, like the flush I mentioned previously. Those are typically one and done as far as showing up in analysis. Unless you continue to use them, you can bank on it being gone with the oil that you put it in with. So we'd like to know about a flush. We really like to know about Restore. Another additive that tends to show up pretty frequently is Ceratec. I should say show up somewhat. Ceratec contains ingredients that are present in a lot of other oils, such as molybdenum, boron, anti-wear additives that, depending on what brand or blend you're running, it's probably going to have some amount of either element in there already. Ceratec is also harmless from our standpoint, but it doesn't necessarily bring about a noticeable change in the wear profile either. That's not to say you shouldn't use it if you don't want to. One thing that I like to keep in mind with additives and really any brand or blend that's in use is that we aren't in the driver's seat of the particular car that this engine is being sampled from. And depending on the driver, they may like how the engine is running with a particular oil in use, a particular additive mix. So we're simply not in the business of saying do or don't use the additive or the oil that you run, especially if you like how that motor is doing with it. What we're here to do is evaluate the wear metals and the oil's physical condition. And if we're seeing a situation where the engine is wearing poorly, or if the oil is in poor physical condition, we're here to alert you as to what's going on and then why it's going on, if we can draw that information from what shows up in the used oil. However, when it comes to you and your maintenance plan, that's a recipe that tends to be all your own, as it should. You're the one who is driving the car or flying the plane or taking care of whatever it is that needs oil to do its job. So if you have your maintenance plan that you like, by all means, that should be the starting point for when you take a sample. We may find that certain additives can get in the way of evaluating a motor's condition. So if I'm talking to an owner that is using Restore and they really want to know how the bearings are doing, then I might tell them, hey, hold off on Restore for a few oil changes and let's see what copper and lead is coming from the engine. And then we can tell you whether or not, let's say, new bearings are needed. If a customer is beginning to worry about a fuel system issue, I might let them know, hey, just so you're aware, anything solvent-based like a flush could mimic fuel. So before you send in that next sample, you might hold off on using a flush or just simply add it after sampling and send the oil in, and then we can see how it's doing. But over the course of regular maintenance, there are some additives that while they do stand out in our results, we're so accustomed to seeing them and what they can do that oftentimes we'll just note the likely result and move on. One of those is Lucas Oil Stabilizer. Depending on how much you add, it can result in a high viscosity. However, when we see a high viscosity with Lucas in use, we can go to how the rest of the sample looks and evaluate rather quickly whether or not that high viscosity is a harmless result of using the additive or whether there might be other players to consider, such as contamination, or other things that may indicate excess heat as a high viscosity otherwise would. This happens at least a few times a day for me alone, and I'm just one of the writers on staff. I'm bound to run into a few diesels running Lucas, nothing else amiss, and I can quickly render that high viscosity as something that the owner doesn't need to worry about. And of course, we'll use trends too in making that evaluation. So if I see a sample where maybe the viscosity is a little higher than usual for that owner and the oil they run, and I see that maybe it's particularly sooty oil as well, well, then we might start to wonder about soot buildup also thickening the oil and causing a result that's a little unusual. And again, we also know what a high viscosity with Lucas in use typically looks like. And if it's way off the map, then we won't jump to conclusions and say it's fine, it's just because of the additive. We're keeping all of this in mind, whether it's your trend data or what we're used to seeing with that additive in use. All of that goes into consideration. But usually, a product like Lucas or Ceratec or Reseal, generally they're fine. But don't take anything for granted. And when you're filling out your slip, when we ask if you're using additives, fill us in on what all the recipe has been. And that way, we're able to make an informed decision about how effective this maintenance plan appears to be working for you, and if we're seeing some ambiguity in the results where maybe holding off on additive would be the right move in order to get the best look at how your engine is doing. That brings today's show to a close. Thank you all for hanging with me. I hope you enjoyed this episode. We'll be back for more with episode 132. Thanks for listening. This is Blackstone Joe signing off.
The Slick Talk podcast is powered by Blackstone Laboratories. If you're ready to start your oil analysis journey, visit blackstone-labs.com to order your free test kit.